Hello, everybody. A reading from Alexander Dugin's The Fourth Political Theory from Chapter 2, Dasein, I believe I'm saying, or Dasein, as an actor. In the search for the subject of the fourth political theory, we must boldly enter into a new hermeneutic circle. The fourth political theory is the whole, which naturally has not yet been sufficiently described and defined. It is comprised of the ideas of its subject, which has been suggested in a preliminary fashion. But, moving constantly between the uncertainty of the whole and the uncertainty of its parts and back again, we gradually begin to clarify more precisely what is at stake. This process, starting from the standpoint of dismissing that which came before it, the rejection of the old hermeneutic circles, liberalism and the individual, Marxism and class, fascism, Nazism, and the state and race, will lead to the development of a more constructive idea sooner or later. Its structure will be further clarified when its hermeneutics comes up against explicitly absurd contradictions which cannot be resolved, or else stops corresponding to the real world. That is, after starting from a certain point, the development of the fourth political theory will begin to develop scientific and rational characteristics, which for the time being are barely discernible behind the power of its groundbreaking intuitions and its revolutionary, Herculean task of overcoming the old ideologies. The entire hermeneutic circle of the fourth political theory should be included in the fourth nomos of the earth. On this, there's a note. Carl Schmitt argued that with the extension of Europe throughout the world via colonialism, a global social order had been established, which for the first time led to the creation of an international system of law, particularly in regard to military conflicts. However, Schmitt believed that this order is now on the decline, and that the birth of a new global order was possibly imminent. This inclusion will specify its content in even more detail and, in particular, will reveal the colossal epistemological potential of geopolitics. The latter, in addition to its purely practical and applied objectives, can be viewed as a broad invitation to think spatially in a postmodern scenario when historical thinking, which dominated the modern era, is becoming irrelevant. On numerous occasions, I have written about the philosophical and sociological potential of geopolitics in my works. Spatiality is one of the most important existential components of Dasein. So the appeal to the fourth nomos of the earth can be tied to the third subject hypothesis of the fourth political theory. Now we can approach the problem of creating the fourth political theory from another direction and examine the contenders for inclusion in this theory from the three classical models. However, before determining which aspect of the three old ideologies can be borrowed from them, having neutralized them and taken them out of context, ripping them out of their own hermeneutic circle, it is important to briefly mention which aspects must be firmly discarded. If we begin with fascism and National Socialism, then here we must definitively reject all forms of racism. Racism is what caused the collapse of the National Socialism in the historical, geopolitical, and theoretical sense. This was not only a historical, but also a philosophical collapse. Racism is based on the belief in the innate objective superiority of one human race over another. It was racism, and not some other aspect of National Socialism, that brought about such consequences, leading to immeasurable suffering on both sides, as well as the collapse of Germany and the Axis powers, not to mention the destruction of the entire ideological project of the Third Way. The criminal practice of wiping out entire ethnic groups, Jews, Gypsies, and Slavs, based on race was precisely rooted in their racial theory. This is what angers and shocks us about Nazism to this day. In addition, Hitler's anti-Semitism and the doctrine that Slavs are subhuman and must be colonized is what led Germany to go to war against the Soviet Union, which cost us millions of lives. It is also true that this resulted in the Germans themselves losing their political freedom and the right to participate in political history for a long time, if not forever. Today, they are left only with their economy and, in the best case scenario, with a concern for ecology. The supporters of the third way were left in the position of ideological outcasts on the margins of society. It was racism, in theory and in practice, that criminalized all other aspects of National Socialism and fascism, causing these worldviews to become the object of curses and vilification. Hitler's racism, however, is only one form of racism. This type of racism is the most obvious, straightforward, and biological, and therefore the most repulsive. There are other forms of racism: cultural, asserting that there are high and low cultures; civilizational, dividing people into those civilized and those insufficiently civilized; technological, viewing technological development as the main criterion for the value of a society; social, stating in the spirit of the Protestant doctrine of predestination that the rich are the best and the greatest as compared to the poor; economic, in which all humanity is ranked according to the degree of material well-being; and evolutionary, for which it is axiomatic that human society is the result of biological development in which the basic processes of the evolution of species, survival of the fittest, natural selection, and so on continue today. European and American societies are fundamentally afflicted with these types of racism, unable to eradicate them from itself despite intensive efforts. Being fully aware of how revolting this phenomenon is, people in the West tend to make racism a taboo. However, all this turns into a witch hunt. New pariahs accused of fascism are its victims, often for no apparent reason. Thus, this very political correctness and its norms are transformed into a totalitarian discipline of political, purely racist exclusions. In this manner, the institutionalized French left liberal anti-racism has gradually become the distribution center of racial hatred. Even Africans suffer from being accused of fascism. Such was the case of the unrestrained defamatory campaign against a well-known black comedian, Dieudonné Mbala, who dared to mock certain hideous features of the contemporary French establishment in his routines, including anti-racism, Ras le Front, SOS Racisme, etc. And I don't speak any Francais. And then what? African comedian Mbala was categorized as brown, that is, accused of fascism and racism. The newest types of racism are glamour, fashion, and the latest trends in information technology. Its norms are set by models, designers, the socialites of political parties, and those who insist on owning only the latest models of mobile phones or laptop computers. Conformity or nonconformity with the glamour code is located at the very base of the mass strategies for social segregation and cultural apartheid. Today, this is not associated directly with the economic factor, but is gradually gaining independent sociological features. This is the ghost of the glamour dictatorship, the new generation of racism. The very ideology of progress is racist in its structure, the assertion that the present is better and more fulfilling than the past, and continual assurances that the future will be even better than the present are discriminations against the past and the present, as well as the humiliation of all those who lived in the past, an insult to the honor and dignity of our ancestors and those of others, and a violation of the rights of the dead. In many cultures, the dead play an important sociological role. They are considered to still be alive in a certain sense, present in this world and participating in its life. This is true of all ancient cultures and civilizations. Billions of inhabitants on this earth believe in this concept to this day. In Chinese civilization, which was built upon the cult of the dead and upon their reverence alongside the living, being dead is regarded as a high social status, in some ways superior to the status of the living. The ideology of progress represents the moral genocide of past generations. In other words, real racism. Equally questionable is the idea of modernization when it is taken as a self-evident virtue. It is easy to detect the obvious signs of racism in it. Undoubtedly, racist is the idea of unipolar globalization. It is based on the idea that the history and values of Western and especially American society are equivalent to universal laws, and artificially tries to construct a global society based on what are actually local and historically specific values. Democracy, the market, parliamentarianism, capitalism, individualism, human rights, and unlimited technological development, these values are local ones, emerging from the particular development of a single culture, and globalization is trying to impose them onto all of humanity as something that is universal and taken for granted. This attempt implicitly argues that the values of all other peoples and cultures are imperfect, underdeveloped, and should be subject to modernization and standardization in imitation of the Western model. Globalization is thus nothing more than a globally deployed model of Western European, or rather Anglo-Saxon ethnocentrism, which is the purest manifestation of racist ideology. As one of its essential features, the fourth political theory rejects all forms and varieties of racism and all forms of normative hierarchization of societies based on ethnic, religious, social, technological, economic, or cultural grounds. Societies can be compared, but we cannot state that any one of them is objectively better than the others. Such an assessment is always subjective, and any attempt to raise a subjective assessment to the status of a theory is racism. This type of an attempt is unscientific and inhumane. The differences between societies in any sense can, in no shape or form, imply the superiority of one over the other. This is a central axiom of the fourth political theory. Furthermore, if anti-racism directly opposes the ideology of National Socialism, in other words, the third political theory, then it also indirectly attacks communism with its class hatred, as well as liberalism with its progressivism, as well as its inherent forms of economic, technological, and cultural racism. Instead of a unipolar world, the fourth political theory insists upon a multipolar world, and instead of universalism, on pluriversalism, which Alain de Benoist brilliantly pointed out in his book, Protiv Liberalisme. I'll read a bit more from Alexander Dugin's very thought-provoking book, The Fourth Political Theory, at another point.